In the dark corners of the American heartland, there are families whose stories have been buried, hidden away from the eyes of the world. These are stories that defy the narrative we've been taught about freedom, progress, and the strength of the American dream. What if I told you that inbreeding, the act of family lines crossing too closely, has not only persisted in this country, but has thrived in some of its most isolated regions, leaving behind generations of human suffering, corruption, and decay. The images you've seen in horror films, the grotesque depictions of broken families who live in silence, struggling under the weight of their own bloodlines. These images are not merely fiction. No, these are the truths buried in the dusty corners of forgotten towns, in backwoods homes where the outside world is a distant thought and the only people you know are your closest relatives. There are women in America today, alive or recently deceased, whose lives are shaped by this horrifying legacy of incest, yet they remain unknown to the majority of the population. Some were born with deformities so extreme that they couldn't hide in public. Others are silent and invisible, their stories erased. For generations, these families lived apart from society, held in the grip of genetic isolation, until the consequences became too undeniable to ignore. It is time for these stories to be told. The history of these women is darker than you could imagine, more haunting than any myth. Some of these women were born from unions that defy not only the laws of society, but the very laws of nature. Marriages between cousins, between siblings, and even between fathers and daughters. These were not rare anomalies, but the accepted norm in some places. And the children born from these unions? They were born to face a life of unimaginable physical and mental challenges. But their pain didn't stop at the birth. Their suffering would echo through the generations, as their children were born with even greater deformities and disabilities, trapped in the twisted web of their family's history. This is not a cautionary tale from the past. It's not something that can be forgotten with time. The families of inbred women still exist today, hidden in plain sight. The truth behind their existence has been suppressed for far too long. But now, we will reveal it all. And once you see the darkness of their lives, you will never look at history, or your own world, the same way again. This isn't just the story of one family. It's the story of a cycle that has repeated itself over and over again, through generations, hidden away by those who had the power to keep it buried. But now, it's time to unearth the truth. Stay with me. We're just beginning. This descent will get darker. You might wish you never asked, but there is no turning back now. The deeper we go, the more you'll realize just how far this has spread. And once you see it, you will understand how fragile the lines between civilization and corruption truly are. Keep watching. What you're about to hear will disturb you, but it will also awaken something you've never fully understood: the price of secrets kept hidden for far too long. You've heard of the Deep South, the Appalachian Mountains, places where time seems to stand still, where communities thrive on isolation and family is everything. But in these remote enclaves, family bonds have been twisted into something far darker. Behind closed doors, entire bloodlines have intertwined to the point of no return. These are places where incest isn't just a tragedy, but an accepted practice, a deadly tradition passed down like a cursed heirloom. Take, for example, the story of Gracie Irene Whittaker. She was born in the hills of West Virginia, a region so isolated that it could have been a world of its own. Here, life was simple, harsh, and unyielding. But for Gracie and her family, life was shaped by something darker. Her parents were first cousins, two families already too closely tied together genetically. But that wasn't enough. Gracie herself would later marry her own double cousin. They were so genetically close, it was as if they were siblings. And the result? The children they created, 15 in total, bore the heavy burden of this genetic disaster. They were born with visible deformities, their eyes misaligned, their bodies disfigured, and their minds forever altered by the weight of their ancestors' sins. One child could barely communicate, only able to grunt as a form of expression. The rest of them, many of whom were never even able to speak, never attended school, and lived in a world far removed from the rest of society, carried the scars of Gracie's choices. But no one outside of their small town saw their suffering. No one cared enough to intervene. Medical records were scarce. The social safety net was non-existent. And so, the Whittaker family lived on, forgotten by most, but not by their own blood. For generations, their lives unfolded in a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Each generation more broken, more twisted by the relentless tight ening of their family tree. Gracie Whittaker's legacy lives on today in her descendants. They still live in the same house, surrounded by the same silence. And though many outside of West Virginia have never heard her name, Gracie's family, her bloodline, continues to whisper the truth of what happens when isolation, tradition, and unchecked incest converge. These families were once hidden from view, their stories suppressed by the very systems meant to protect them. And yet, they persist. The cost of this isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was generational. And in the most twisted corners of America, it still continues. But this is only one story. There are more, much more. And as we go deeper, you'll begin to see the true horror of these families. You'll see the ways in which society, complicit in its silence, allowed these stories to unfold without ever taking action. Stay with me. What you're about to hear will force you to confront something you may not be ready for. The truth isn't always easy to face, but it's time you learned just how deep this goes. It's easy to assume that what we hear about the past, the horrors of incest in royal bloodlines or far-off places, is a thing of fantasy, a distortion of reality. But what if I told you that the darkest chapters of America's history aren't tucked away in books or museums? What if they are happening now, right beneath our noses? There are families living in the fringes of this country whose bloodlines are so tightly wound their very existence is a product of generations of genetic decay. The cycle of inbreeding doesn't just create deformities, it alters the course of entire lives. This is the story of Laureen, the daughter of Gracie Whittaker. Laureen was born into a web of genetic isolation that spiraled deeper with every passing year. From the moment she entered this world, her fate was sealed. Laureen was born unable to speak, unable to engage with the world as other children did. Her physical and mental development was stunted. Her eyes couldn't track movement like those of a normal child. Her muscles were weak. Every part of her was affected by the twisted union of her parents. But it wasn't just Laureen. It was the entire Whittaker family. By the time Lorene was old enough to realize the gravity of her condition, the patterns had already become clear. She was part of a bloodline so tightly bound by incest that her very existence was the result of decades of self-inflicted suffering. But there was no escape. No outsiders intervened. No help came. Lorene's life unfolded within the closed loop of her family, surrounded by others just like her. People whose lives had been shaped, confined, and ultimately destroyed by the sins of their ancestors. Lorene never attended school. She never learned to read. She never had a real chance to grow beyond the confines of her family's isolation. In the early years of her life, no one truly cared to understand her condition. No diagnosis came. No social services came to her aid. She lived and died in silence, surrounded by a family equally as cursed as she was. But this isn't an isolated case. No, Lorene's life is just one example of a far deeper sickness running through the veins of American society. We've been taught to believe that these horrors belong to some ancient, distant past. But what happens when these stories remain hidden from the world? What happens when we turn a blind eye to the truth? As we continue, you'll realize that this isn't a relic of history. It's a present-day nightmare. And the price of ignorance will be revealed in the very lives of those who were left to suffer in silence. Do you understand? The system that allows this to happen is not just one of isolated families. It's a system of control, one that manipulates, isolates, and hides the truth from the rest of us. Stay with me, because this is where it gets darker, where it becomes clear that the forces that kept these families hidden were more powerful than we ever imagined. Now, let's move from the mountains of West Virginia, from the forgotten corners of America, to the stark, undeniable truth that still walks among us in hidden rooms, in secret lives. We've seen what happens when families breed so closely that they cannot escape the consequences of their actions. But there are more stories where the world doesn't just ignore the pain, but actively suppresses it. These stories are the modern-day manifestations of a deeper, more insidious force. Forces that control the narrative, shaping what we are allowed to know and what we are forced to forget. Take the case of Rita, a child born into a world so deeply intertwined with corruption that it wasn't even clear she was a victim until it was too late. Born in Texas, in the shadows of a home that no one cared to investigate, Rita's story began not in the sterile white rooms of a hospital, but in a hidden room in a house that should never have been kept secret. Her mother, just a teenager, gave birth to a daughter who would forever carry the consequences of an unforgivable bond. Her mother and father were one in the same. At first, it was just a small child with breathing problems, a baby who couldn't speak, whose heart rhythm didn't match the normal cadence of life. But as the years went on, it became more clear. Rita had inherited the deadly price of incest on a scale so extreme that even genetic testing couldn't deny the truth. Her biological parents shared so much identical DNA that it set off alarms in every medical professional who dared look too closely. But Rita's story isn't one of ignorance, it's one of willful blindness. The state of Texas, the system designed to protect the vulnerable, failed her. Her parents were both incarcerated, but the damage had already been done. Rita, a girl born from the blood of her own father, would never live a life free of suffering. Her brain, her body, her very soul, were twisted by a bloodline that should have never existed. And yet, Rita's fate didn't just belong to her. It's the fate of thousands of children like her, abandoned by a system that too often ignores the blood-soaked truths it doesn't want to confront. These families live in the shadows, their pain masked by the lies of silence and denial. The truth that Rita's story represents isn't just about incest. It's about the corruption of systems that protect the perpetrators, the silent killers who perpetuate these cycles without consequence. It's a conspiracy of silence that stretches across generations. The real question isn't just about Rita's life. It's about all the children like her. It's about the countless victims who are swept under the rug because their suffering doesn't fit the narrative we want to believe. We all like to think that these things are isolated incidents, far away from our own experience. But what if they're not? What if this is happening in your own backyard, behind closed doors, in families you might know? The truth is uncomfortable. The truth will challenge everything you've been taught. But it's time for you to wake up. These stories aren't anomalies. They are the natural result of a society that has chosen to ignore the depths of its own corruption. But let's move deeper. Let's shed the veil of discomfort and step into the shadows of history. You've already seen how these families, trapped by their own bloodlines, suffer and rot in silence. But what about those who were born into systems that conditioned them, that manipulated them from birth, shaping their very destiny? Let's talk about the Hutterites, a community so deeply embedded in tradition that it blinds itself to the horrors it creates. Maria was born in the 1970s in a South Dakota Hutterite colony, a place where simplicity was revered, where religion was everything, and where bloodlines were kept pure. But purity, in this case, was a curse. Her parents were second cousins, part of a long tradition of intermarriage. To the Hutterites, this wasn't scandal. It was cultural preservation. They believed that inbreeding was essential to maintaining their tight-knit community. But as Maria's story would show, even distant inbreeding carries consequences, ones that no amount of faith or tradition can wash away. Maria was born with a cleft palate, misshapen ears, and a recessed chin. These were physical signs that her genetic inheritance had been altered by the repeated crossings of bloodlines. But what made Maria's story different wasn't just her physical deformities. Unlike many others born into these closed systems, Maria's mind wasn't as severely affected. She could think, she could understand, and with the right care, she learned to communicate, to sign, to function within the confines of her limited world. But what does this tell us? Maria's case isn't the worst outcome, but it is the most dangerous kind of lie. You see, the Hutterites didn't ostracize her. In fact, they celebrated her resilience. But the real question is, should anyone be celebrating the persistence of a system that produces these outcomes? Should we be applauding a community that, despite its love and faith, creates generations of suffering just to maintain the integrity of their traditions? Maria grew up to become a caregiver, a figure of strength in a world that had already broken her. Her life didn't end in tragedy, but that doesn't mean her story isn't a warning. It's a glimpse into a much larger problem, one where cultural norms justify human suffering and where entire communities turn a blind eye to the truth in the name of tradition. This is a story of survival, yes, but it's also a story of manipulation. a story of a society that, in its attempt to preserve its purity, has condemned its members to a fate of twisted genetics, physical deformity, and psychological limitation. And the question remains, how many more stories like Maria's are out there living in the shadows, too afraid to speak? If you haven't already felt the weight of this truth, now is the time to confront it. The systems that allow this to happen aren't just cultural. They are institutional. They are designed to keep you ignorant, to keep the suffering hidden behind the curtain of tradition. But what happens when that curtain is pulled back? What happens when the truth is laid bare as it is here before you? Do you see the system for what it is? Do you understand the consequences of ignoring what you've just learned? Stay with me. We're not done. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just about isolated families. It's about a world where manipulation is the norm, where control runs deeper than we can imagine. You have to see it to understand it. Only then can you truly awaken to the truth of how far this rabbit hole goes. Now that the veil has been lifted, let's delve into something even darker. You've heard the stories of the Whitakers, of Gracie and her children. Stories of generations ravaged by incest, hidden away from the world. But what if I told you that this wasn't just a tragedy confined to a few isolated communities? What if I told you that the systemic forces behind this weren't just an unfortunate accident, but a deliberate and insidious strategy employed to manipulate and control entire populations? Think for a moment about how easy it is to dismiss these families as anomalies, people on the fringe of society who don't matter. But what if they do? What if the pain of these isolated, inbred families is actually a reflection of something much larger, something happening all around us, right now? What if the mechanisms that sustain this suffering aren't accidents of nature, but a well-oiled machine designed to perpetuate it? This isn't just a conspiracy theory. It's the harsh truth hidden in plain sight. Human suffering is a tool. It is a means of control, a way to keep entire groups of people locked into cycles of poverty, ignorance, and physical and mental decay. Think about it. How much easier is it to control a population when you keep it isolated, when you break their will, when you confine them to spaces where they can't see the world beyond their walls? What better way to keep people under control than by keeping them ignorant, by tying them to a single idea, a single tradition, so tightly that they cannot escape? The families trapped in this cycle of inbreeding didn't just create their own suffering. They were caught in a system that made their suffering inevitable. They lived in isolation, cut off from the resources and support that could have saved them. But more importantly, they were kept in that isolation by a society that chose to look the other way, to pretend that these families didn't exist. Because the truth is, if we allowed them to be seen, if we confronted the reality of their lives, we would have to face something much more uncomfortable. The fact that this kind of suffering is not an accident. It is the result of systemic oppression, of forces beyond their control, forces that thrive on the darkness of ignorance and the isolation of the human spirit. When we look at these families, when we see the tragic consequences of incest, we must ask ourselves, what does this say about the systems that allowed them to live in this way? And the deeper question, how many more families, how many more people are out there living in the shadows, hidden from view, suffering because the system has chosen to ignore them? It's easy to turn a blind eye. It's easy to pretend that these families are just outliers, disconnected from the rest of us. But the truth is, they are us. They are part of a system that has been designed to perpetuate suffering, to trap people in cycles they cannot escape, and to keep the truth buried deep beneath the surface. But here's the key. Once you see it, once you understand the patterns, you cannot unsee them. And once you see how deep the manipulation runs, you will never look at the world the same way again. You've made it this far. You've descended down into the depths of hidden history, the dark history that was never meant to be seen. But now, you stand at the precipice of understanding. You've seen the true cost of manipulation, of keeping people locked in cycles of suffering and ignorance. You've seen how generations of inbred families are the product of forces beyond their control. And yet, it is their pain that speaks to a much larger truth. But the real question is, what now? What do we do with this knowledge? The world you once thought you understood is not the same anymore. These families, hidden away in the shadows, represent more than just an isolated tragedy. They are the manifestation of something far more sinister, a society that has abandoned its responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to confront the dark corners of its own past. There is a lesson here, a lesson that will change you. What happens when you strip away the veneer of civilization? What happens when you take away the distractions, the comforts, the lies, and look at the truth beneath? The truth is uncomfortable, it is painful, and it is not for the faint of heart. But it is the truth nonetheless. You are now part of a rare group, those who have seen beyond the veil, and once you see it, you can never forget it. You can never return to the world of ignorance, to the safe, comfortable narratives that have kept you blind. The manipulation that perpetuates these cycles of suffering is not a thing of the past. It's happening now in real time, and it will continue unless we, as a society, choose to confront it. So, I ask you this. Will you speak the truth? Will you carry the burden of this knowledge, knowing that it may forever change how you view the world? It's easy to remain silent. It's easiest to look away. But you know better now. And once you know the truth, you must decide. Will you let it die with you, or will you share it, no matter the cost? The choice is yours. But remember, what you do with this knowledge will define who you are from this moment forward. Now, I want you to reflect. What kind of man are you becoming in the face of this darkness? And, more importantly, what will you do about it?